How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be discussing a recent podcast that was done by Joe Rogan and Colion Noir. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Joe Rogan. If you're not, you've been living under a rock. He has the biggest podcast out there right now. And also, if you're in the gun community or the gun range and you don't know who Colion Noir is, you're also living under a rock because he's probably one of the most influential Second Amendment advocates we have right now. So as of today of me making this video, Joe Rogan just put out a new podcast with Colion Noir, and in it they discuss a lot of the Second Amendment things that are going on right now in our society in relation to the virus, in relation to the riots and looting, the death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, the Chaz issues, all of that stuff they addressed in this podcast. But the goal of this video is to address some of those California specific things that were brought up during the discussion at various points. Joe Rogan, of course, lives in California. He lives in LA. The podcast is based out of LA, where in contrast, Colion Noir, he lives in Texas. So a lot of the issues when they were discussing, there was kind of this mix of states issues where maybe Colion Noir wasn't that versed on what exactly is going on in California. And Joe Rogan, even though he is a firearms advocate in some way, he has firearms, but he's not well versed in the California specific laws. So I think some things got lost in the translation, and my goal with this video is to clear up some of those California Second Amendment issues that came up. So one of the first things that came up was when Colion Noir gave Joe Rogan the Vaultic safe, or his signature safe. And the basis of this, and when they were talking about it, Colion Noir said that he carries this because in the state of California, he can't have his concealed carry weapon on him, which we'll address later, but he uses this to transport his firearm. Now, in the state of California, we have very strict transportation laws and we have very strict concealed carry laws, things like that. But generally, when you're transporting a handgun in the state of California, it has to be unloaded and in a locked container. Now, there are some varying rules of what exactly a locked container is and what exactly a loaded or unloaded firearm is. But generally, the rule is that as long as the magazine with the rounds in it is not inside the firearm, or a round is chambered in the firearm, then it is not considered loaded, it is considered unloaded. So that was just an interesting thing that came up right off the bat. So the second thing that came up when it was kind of in relation to the transportation issue was that Colion Noir stated to Joe Rogan that he cannot conceal carry his weapon in the state of California, even though he has a carry permit in the state of Texas. And what this hints on is the California's laws in regards to reciprocity with other carry permits. In the state of California, the state does not recognize any other state's carry permit, which is really frustrating, and is frustrating for a lot of people like Colion Noir who come into the state of California. They may have a permit in another state. They may have went through another state's requirements, background check, all that to get their carry permit. But as soon as they cross the border, they are no longer, trusted to have a firearm on them because the state of California says that they are above all other states and that they only recognize their own permit. So that's why specifically Colion Noir, can't carry a handgun in the state of California, even though he has a permit in the state of Texas. Now, another big issue that kept coming up, and it came up various times during the discussion, during the podcast, had to do with the 10-day waiting period and the 10-day requirement in the state of California. So here in California, we have a lot stricter gun laws, which is to be expected. Like other states like New York, California is very liberal, and we've put in a lot of gun control laws. One of those being that the state of California requires that when you are purchasing a firearm, you not only have to go through the background check, which is instant. It goes to the federal government. The 4473 goes to the federal government, but then it goes to the California Department of Justice where they check their system. And then there is a 10-day waiting period here in this state. And the 10-day waiting period is not for the running of the background check, but essentially it is a 10-day waiting period for you to take possession of the firearm. As Colion Noir stated in the podcast, the general background checks are almost instant. I know when I lived in Pennsylvania and I purchased some firearms, I think I only had to wait 30 minutes for the entirety of the background checks to be run, and then I could go home with the firearm right then and there, because they didn't require a waiting period to take possession of the firearm. It is not a waiting period for the background check to be run, but it's just simply a waiting period to take possession. One of the other issues with the 10-day waiting period that wasn't mentioned in the podcast, probably because Colion Noir is not familiar with it and Joe Rogan's probably not familiar with it, has to do with, they were talking about the mass amount of people who are waiting in line to purchase firearms. They talked about the 10-day waiting period, but what they didn't know was Because of the 10-day waiting period and it going to the California Department of Justice and the DRO system, what we actually saw play out here in the state during all this, rush to buy firearms was that people were actually not even getting approved from the California DOJ within that 10-day period that they were required to. What actually happened is a lot of people didn't get confirmation or weren't allowed to take possession of their firearm within that 10-day period. It actually extended very far beyond that. Some people 30 days, some people even longer. And especially in a time when people, like they mentioned, really felt like they needed firearms, really wanted to get their hands on them. What we actually saw play out is when there was a huge flux of individuals trying to purchase firearms, we saw waiting periods well beyond that. And a lot of people, who knows, that really needed to get a firearm weren't able to do that. Along these lines, they also brought up this issue of private party transfers. Now, here is some nuance that they didn't really address in the podcast, probably because Colion Noir is not well versed in what exactly California requires. And that is, he mentioned that in the state of Texas, when it comes to private party transfers, there is no requirement that a background check be ran or that you have to go to an FFL. He mentioned that it is pretty much discretionary up to the individual. If they determine that they want to go run a background check or go to an FFL, they can do that, but they are not required. This is vastly different than what we have here in the state of California, where there are laws on the book that private party transfers, it doesn't even matter if I was going to sell a gun to Joe Rogan, even though it's a private party transfer, we would have to go to an FFL. The only exception for private party transfers outside of an FFL, outside of background checks, has to do with interfamiliar transfers. If I was going to transfer a firearm outside of going to an FFL, it would have to be someone in my immediate family, like my parents, like my spouse, like my children. That's it. There was also another discussion about Colion Noir talking about when he's pulled over and he hands his license and his carry license or his carry permit to an officer. And I kind of wanted to address this a little bit because here in California, there is no general rule or general duty to notify an officer that you have a concealed weapon on you. Now, this might be different in the state of Texas, and this might be why Colion Noir has to do that. I'm not sure. But here in the state of California, there's not a general rule. Instead, since our permits are issued by the local law enforcement agencies like the county sheriff or the city PD, these agencies get to dictate whether an individual has a duty to inform. If your issuing agency says that you have to notify an officer once you make contact with them that you have a concealed weapon on you, you have to do that. But generally here in the state, that is not required. There was also another awesome and kind of interesting discussion that went on between Colion Noir and Joe Rogan, and they were talking about magazine capacity and a reference that a prior guest on the podcast made about why would you need 50-round magazines. They're not necessary. You don't need an AR-15 with that. Now, of course, here in the state of California, we are very familiar with those arguments. And in fact, we have laws in place which place restrictions on magazine capacities and essentially label any magazine that carries more than 10 rounds as a large capacity magazine. Now, we've had some nuance here in the state where there was a period of time or a week period where individuals were able to purchase magazines that held more than 10 rounds, and we label that as Freedom Week. Now, this case has recently made its way all the way up to the Ninth Circuit, and this argument that they started to talk about, that Joe Rogan and Colion Noir started talking about in reference to individuals stating that, having only 10 rounds makes you have to reload and it limits the damage that a mass shooter could do. We are very familiar with that argument, and in fact, recently when the Ninth Circuit heard the case of Duncan v. Becerra, which has to do with magazine capacity, we saw the Attorney General's representative make this very argument, and it was part of the Attorney General's primary basis for instituting the magazine limitation here in the state, is that they claimed that the magazine limitation helped to prevent mass shootings and massacres because it would force an individual to reload. And it's just really interesting that they kind of grappled with this concept in the podcast when we just saw the same thing pretty much get addressed in the Ninth Circuit. And we actually saw that a lot of those judges that were sitting on the Ninth Circuit did not take favorably to this argument that the Attorney General's office put forward. There was also another really interesting discussion, and it kind of got lost in translation a little bit. I think Joe Rogan kind of mistaked what Colion Noir was actually saying. And this was in reference to talking about individuals who say that the Second Amendment only applies to specific weapons like muskets. And in response to this, Colion Noir said, well, they only had quills and parchment, also when they wrote the Second Amendment. And what he was specifically referencing here is what I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. What he's stating is, therefore, under that same logic, the First Amendment and your freedom of speech would only apply to things that they had common during that time, like parchment, quills, maybe even a little bit of printing, but it wouldn't apply to the plethora of free speech that we have today with all of our technology, social media sites, stuff like that. But Colion Noir is right on the money, and in fact, this harkens to what exactly the Supreme Court said in Heller v. DC. And it goes actually to what Justice Scalia said in his opinion. And what Justice Scalia stated was that the Second Amendment is not limited just to those weapons that were in place during the time of the writing of the Second Amendment, but instead it expands and covers all firearms and all weapons that are in common use. And so there hasn't been a lot of clarity of what exactly a common use weapon is, and we've had a lot of confusion with some lower courts actually trying to interpret what common use is. But the Supreme Court has actually shot down this argument that we hear all the time where the Second Amendment only covers muskets. Instead, what the Supreme Court has actually said is no, it extends to all firearms which are in common use. And one of the last things I wanted to address has to do with this discussion that Colion Noir and Joe Rogan had about the aggregation of laws, where someone will say, XYZ law is rational, it's reasonable, we should put it in place. But he mentioned, yeah, maybe one law will seem rational and you put it into effect, but when it builds on another one, or you put another one in place, and you put another one in place, the interplay between them and the conjunction of all of them does not make the entirety of the gun control in a state very reasonable or very rational. And we're seeing that play out here in the state of California. Here in the state, we have so many gun control laws. We have laws restricting the purchase of ammunition. We have laws restricting the purchase of various firearms, how to do background checks, the 10-day waiting period. And it really creates this scenario that Colion Noir mentioned where not only is the entry very expensive to guns in the state of California and people wanting to have firearms, but it also deters a lot of people from wanting to purchase firearms. So it's just interesting that they were talking about this weird building of multiple gun control laws and the issues that could arise out of that, when in fact here in the state of California we are seeing that play out in full force. But all in all, I thought the conversation between Colion Noir and Joe Rogan was very beneficial to a lot of people who maybe don't even really know a whole lot about firearms, don't know a whole lot about the Second Amendment. And I'm really appreciative of Joe Rogan and also Colion Noir for talking about these critical issues, especially right now when it's a very hot topic. So I highly recommend you guys go and watch that podcast. And also I highly recommend you guys go, especially if you're not even familiar with Colion Noir and you're into firearms and Second Amendment, I would highly recommend you guys go follow him on YouTube, all of his other social media accounts. So if you found this video educational and it helped you in any way, go ahead and subscribe and make a lot of videos addressing the Second Amendment and California-specific issues relating to the Second Amendment. So as always, thanks you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, a nation that draws a great distinction between its scholars and its warriors, of its laws run by cowards and its wars fought by fools.